that producer equilibrium is a model that helps us understand how producer allocates their spending between different resources, right? Now, we did discuss that to produce any product, producer can use different resources, right? So the simplest example of that could be capital and labor, right? So in most instances of production, labor and capital are substitutable, right? Which means that you can use more labor, less capital, or more capital and less labor, right? But how will the producer decide which of the resources to use? That is what this model helps us understand. Okay. Now, moving forward, what we need to understand is that we have already talked about it, that it's a model that helps you predict how producer will allocate the investment between different resources or inputs, right? What should a producer consider to decide which resource to use? So that is the big question that producer equilibrium model is solving. So this is the big question that producer equilibrium model is solving. Okay, now what's the objective of a producer? Think about this. Just like we did, we discussed what the objective of a consumer is. Similarly, we did mention that the producer is willing to maximize the output with available amount of investment. So whatever amount is available to invest in the business, with that, the producer wants to maximize investment. And what two graphs for this producer equilibrium, what are the two graphs that we need to have for this, right? Now we'll be doing a quick recap because we've already done this in the last class as well, right? So you have to simply draw a graph, right? This is known as producer equilibrium graph, producer equilibrium model, whatever you want to call it, right? Now you have two axes. On one axis, you will take the quantity of one resource, right? So let's say I'm thinking of capital on the y-axis, and let's take the quantities of labor, the other resource, on the x-axis, right? Okay. Now, what are the two graphs that you need to have to make this producer equilibrium model? The first one is isocost. What is isocost? Let me tell you. So isocost is a graph that shows the quantities of the two resources that a producer can afford, right? So isocost is a graph that shows quantities of two resources, capital and labor, that is affordable for the producer with available investment, right? That's what it shows, right? And the second one is isocont. Exactly, right? So isocost shows you what quantities of the two resources are affordable for a producer with available investment. So we do know that if you choose any point within the line, that is obviously affordable with available investment. Any point even on the line is affordable, right? You have enough of investment, but any point outside the curve is not affordable because you don't have enough of investment, right? The second thing that you need over here, right? The second thing that you need over here is the isocont that you mentioned. Very nice, right? So isocont is a graph that shows combination of the two goods. Isocont is a graph that shows combination of two goods that yield the same level of output, right? So it's a downward sloping curve. It's a downward sloping curve like this, and that shows you, one isocont shows you different combination of two resources, in this case, as you can see, capital and labor, that yield the same level of output for the consumer, right? Just give me a second, right? Okay. And then you have any curve, sorry about that, right? So it's always a challenge, right? And the two isocont will always be parallel to each other. You know that, right? So on and so forth, right? So isoconts are down sloping graph that shows the combination of the two goods that yield the same level of output. Okay, now let's try making this a little right. So second one, right? It goes like this, right? Okay. So Preet, is this clear? Okay. And then obviously you can stretch them and so on. Okay. Now think about this. Now out of these three isoconts, each of these isocont will show you the total quantity that this isocont represents, right? So each of these isoconts show you the total quantities of output that can be produced while operating on these three curves, right? So if you operate on the orange isocont, which is the lowest of the three, that will help you produce how many units of the good? 100 units of the good, whatever good the producer is producing. That could be anything, right? That could be cars, that could be cell phones, that could be things like that. And the blue isocont, as you can see, helps you produce how many units of the good? 200 units of the good. And the green isocont helps you produce 300 units of the good, right? So we did talk about this as well. Okay, so we know, right, where the isocost and the isocont are tangent to each other, right? So on this graph, where the isocost and the isocont are tangent to each other, what point is this? That is this point. That is the point of producer equilibrium. That is the point of producer equilibrium. Now, what will this point of producer equilibrium show you? This shows you the quantities of the two resources, that this producer will hire to produce an output, of how many goods? To produce an output of 200 goods, 200 units of the good, right? So where the isocont and the isocost are tangent to each other, which means that this purple line, which was the isocost, and this blue downward sloping curve, which is the isocont, where these two are equal, that is the point of producer equilibrium. That shows you the quantities, of the two resources, capital and labor, right? Let's say 10 units of capital and 5 units of labor that you would want to employ to produce an output of 200 units of the good. Is this simple? Okay. Now, mathematically, we discussed that where the two curves are tangent to each other, right? Where the two lines or curves are tangent to each other, right? It is that their gradient will be the same. Where isocont and isocost are tangent to each other, that is the equilibrium point in producer equilibrium diagram, right? Now, the gradient of the two lines will be the same. I did mention that you just need to know the formulas of the gradients. You just need to know the formulas. You don't need to know how these gradients are derived. You don't need to know that as part of economics. Not as part of economics, obviously as part of maths, yes. Okay. The gradient of isocost will always be negative. Why? Because it's a downward sloping line. Negative of PL. What is PL? PL is the price of the good on the x-axis. Are you getting me? But since I've always taken labor on the x-axis and always taken capital on the y-axis, so I've written it down as the price of the resource on the x-axis, that would be PL, and the price of the resource on the y-axis, that is capital, so price of K, right? And I did mention that capital is normally denoted with K. Like, it is a little weird, but that's how it works in economics, right? Easy. We good on this, students? Any confusion, anything that's not clear, right? Okay. Now, the second thing, what is the gradient of isocont? Very nice. So the gradient of isocont is negative marginal product of labor, right? Negative marginal product of labor divided by marginal product of capital, right? Now, this is something that we talked about in the last class, and this is where we'll spend most of the time. Now, have a look at this. What is marginal product of labor? Marginal means additional. Product in economic means output, and labor is labor, right? Labor is a resource. We know that. Marginal product of labor refers to additional output produced by each additional unit of labor hired, right? Now, what example I gave you in the last class, right? If, let's say, this is the units of labor that a factory owner is hiring, right? So there's a factory that manufactures anything. I don't know, footballs. You can think about they manufacture, let's say, bottles of water, or they manufacture juices, or let's say anything, right? Now, this is the units of the labor that this factory is hiring: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. What is the total output that gets produced after hiring each, after hiring certain units of labor? So the first row is showing you that after hiring the first person, the total output of the company was 30 units. After hiring the second person in the factory, the total output gone up to 45, and then 55, and then 60, and then 63. Now, after we have gotten this data, I will share all of these with you. I'll share the entire folder. So this is how it works. Thank you for asking me, Preet. Obviously, these notes is for the students. And what I'll do is that this entire folder, this is basically how it happens. All you have to do is to just send me your email address, right? And I'll send you those resources, right? And then you can view those resources as per your own convenience. But you just need to be a little careful. I will make the different folder for AS and A2. But yeah, but right now I haven't classified. And there are some other already resources made with me previously. So I will also share those as well, right? Just a second, just give me a minute. Okay, so moving forward, perfect. Let's keep moving. Okay, now after you have these two pieces of information, what is the unit of the labor and what is the total output that is being produced, then you can calculate what we are interested in calculating, which is marginal product. Marginal product is just additional output produced by each additional unit of labor hired. What is marginal product of labor? Additional output produced by each additional unit of labor hired. Okay. Now, when you hired the first guy, think about this. So your total output increased from 0 to 30, right? Obviously, because when you don't have any labor, then what were you producing? Most probably nothing, right? So your marginal product for the first unit of labor was 30. For the second unit was 15. How did we calculate this? We subtracted 30 from 45. So after 2 units of labor, the total output is 45. So after the first unit of labor, it was 30. So that technically means that the second guy on his own produced how many units? 15 units. Similarly, when you subtract the total output of 55, which is at the level of 3 units of labor, from when from 55 you subtract 45, right? You get 10, which is the marginal product for the third unit of labor, and similarly for the fourth and the fifth, right? This is making sense. So this technically means that these are the quantities 10, 15, 10, 5, and 4, which these units of labor are producing, right? So the first guy on his own produced 30 units of the good. The second guy on his own produced 15 units of the good. The third guy produced 10, the fourth, fifth, and the fifth guy produced only 3 units of the good, right? Okay, now that is the question that I asked you. Is the total output of the firm increasing? It is increasing, but it is increasing at a diminishing rate. It is increasing, but it is increasing at a diminishing rate. Each additional labor contributes less output compared to the previous unit of labor. Each additional labor contributes less output compared to the previous unit of labor. And this is known as law of diminishing marginal product of labor, right? This is known as law of diminishing marginal product of labor. Will this always exist, right? The next question you should be asking yourself, will this always exist? Diminishing, yes, right? So in every type of business, in the short run, this concept will hold true. Okay, now think about this. Here I've added one technical word that I'll explain you in a bit, right? So my question was, will the diminishing marginal product of labor always exist, right? That's the question that we're answering. And the answer to that, I said, yes, in every type of business, in the short run, this concept will hold true. Now, every type of business, we are clear on that. But what about the short run? Now, there is a major distinction in economics between short run and long run, but I will not explain you that right now, because the very next topic after this we have is the type of cost. The very next topic after this that we'll discuss is the type of cost. Like, what are the different types of cost in a business? Fixed cost, variable cost, right? You might remember this concept from your IGCSE O levels as well, right? So that is where we will dive deep into the concept of short run and long run, right? So for now, you don't need to worry, right? Then I wanted to give you some idea between variable inputs and fixed inputs. So what is variable input, right? So labor is a variable input. These inputs like labor are relatively easy to increase or decrease in quantities at certain point in time. Fixed inputs are like land or capital. These inputs like capital and even land often are relatively difficult to increase or decrease in quantity at certain point in time, right? Okay. This being said, now we'll talk about the marginal product of what would be the definition of marginal product of capital? Preet, do you want to take a chance at it? What would be the definition of marginal product of labor? What can you say? So you know already what was the marginal product of labor. Now it is just the marginal product of capital. So what do you think this shows us? Yeah. So marginal product of capital would be additional units of output produced with additional unit of capital. Excellent. Perfect. Absolutely correct, right? So marginal product of capital refers to additional quantities of output, quantity of output produced by, right? Marginal product of capital, additional quantity of output produced by one more unit of capital, right? So one more unit of capital, how much additional quantity of output you're producing, that is your marginal product of capital. Okay, are we good on this? Now let's come to the very main part where we are about to discuss this equilibrium point. Now coming to the very main part, to the producer equilibrium, right? Now where the two lines are tangent to each other, as I told you, that shows you producer equilibrium, right? That shows you the quantity of the capital, units of capital and the units of labor that the company would want to hire. Okay. Now at this equilibrium point, Preet, at this equilibrium point, this formula hold true. So I'm just rearranging this. I'm just rearranging these two, right? So I'm telling you in advance so that you don't feel confused. So the gradient of isocost and the gradient of isocont are equal to each other at the point of equilibrium, right? And we are just rearranging these two values and writing the final form. And the final form, as we say, equimarginal principle, final form producer equilibrium will be as follows, which is marginal product of capital, marginal product of capital, right, divided by price of capital is equals to marginal product of labor divided by price of labor. Is it making sense, Preet? Right? So I've just rearranged that and the negative signs have vanished, just like it happened in the consumer equilibrium. And what's the reason for that? The negative sign vanished because of the fact that there were negative signs in both the cases. So obviously they cancel each other out. They cancel each other out. Any confusion so far? Right? Now think about this. Let's try to understand. So if you remember, we also did something very similar in consumer equilibrium, right? So it was marginal product, it was marginal utility of product X divided by price of X. And that used to be equal to marginal utility of Y divided by price of Y. Could you recall, right? Now, in this case, in the case of producer equilibrium, the final form becomes marginal product of capital divided by price of capital. This being equals to marginal product of labor divided by price of labor, right? Okay. Now, this being said, what is this showing us, right? This shows us that the, right, left side of the equation shows the output capital produces for each dollar spent on capital, and the right side of the equation shows the output produced by labor against each dollar spent on labor, right? Preet, are you following me? Right? Now, what is this equation showing? I've not written any complicated explanation. I've just explained it in simple English. Now, let's see what this means. The left-hand side of the equation shows the output that capital produces for each dollar spent on capital, and the right side of the equation shows the output that labor produces against each dollar spent on labor, right? How do we know that? Now think about this. If I say that MPK, now just try to imagine how do we plug in values. So marginal product of capital is 20 units, right? So marginal product of capital is 20 units. Each additional unit of capital at the moment is making the business 20 units. And the marginal product of labor right? Each additional unit of labor at the moment is making you, let's say, 50 units. Is this helpful? Read. Okay. Now, similarly, the price of labor, let's say, is $10, and the price of capital, let's say, is $15. Is this clear? Or let's reverse it a little bit. Let's make this 15 and let's make this 10, right? Okay. Now think about this, Preet. All you have to do is to just plug in the values and see what the answer turns out to be. So when you divide 20 with 10, so marginal product of capital divided by price of capital. So 20 divided by 10 gives you how much? So what you are technically doing, MPK divided by PK, right? So that gives you 20 divided by 10. So how much is that equal to? 2 units per dollar. Am I right with this? Have I written? Is this the correct explanation or not? Is this the correct explanation? Right? Because what do we have in the numerator? What do we have in the numerator? In the numerator, we have the output, marginal product of capital, which is the output, additional quantity. And what do we have in the denominator? The price of that resource, which is capital, right? So 20 divided by 10 gives you 2 units per dollar. So this means if the producer spends $1 on capital, that producer gets to produce 2 units of the good. Easy, simple. Okay, we got the productivity. Okay, now let's do the same exercise for the labor. So what is the marginal product of labor divided by price of labor? So that gives you 50 units are the units that are produced by labor. And how much you're paying to each labor? You're paying $15 to each unit of labor, right? So 50 divided by 15, 2 times 3. It gives you something 3 point something. I don't know exactly. So that gives you 10, that gives you 3.33. 3.33 units per dollar. How much is labor producing you? Does this make sense? Right? So this is showing you the productivity of the labor. So for each dollar that the producer spends on labor produce 3.33 units of whatever good that is being produced. And if the producer spends each dollar on capital, that produces only 2 units against each dollar, right? Now, which of the two resources is more productive? Or you can simply say more productive or cheaper, right? Productive would be a better word, right? Like in terms of cost, which of the two resources is more productive? Again, think again, breathe. If you give $1 and that makes you as a producer 2 units, would that then you be more happy? Or if you give $1 to labor and that gives you 3.33 units, labor is cheaper, right? As it makes more units of output against each dollar spent on labor. Any confusion? Right? So that's more productive. Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Right? So which of the two resources is more productive? Labor, as it makes more units of output against each dollar spent on labor, right? We got on this? So this is what this equimarginal principle, or the final form of producer equilibrium, shows us. This is what the final form of producer equilibrium shows us. Now, why did I say that the two are equal? Because in equilibrium position, only in this equilibrium position, the two things will be the same. The two values will be the same. See, this is making sense. So at other points, this formula will not hold true. Like it will not hold true in the sense that the two values will not be equal. But at the equilibrium point, sorry about that, but at the equilibrium point where the two lines are tangent to each other, that is, so at this point, this formula that I've written over there, which is marginal product of capital divided by price of capital, would be exactly equal. The marginal product of capital divided by price of capital would be exactly equal to what? That would be exactly equal to marginal product of labor divided by price of labor. Is it making sense? Are we good? Any confusion? Anything that's not clear? Right? Perfect. Okay. Now, what this shows us eventually, something very similar. This formula again is showing us something very similar to what we discussed in the consumer equilibrium model, right? That consumers, so let me recap of what we discussed in the consumer equilibrium model. That consumer would want to spend his money where he or she gets the highest return. And what was the highest returns in consumer equilibrium model? The utility. So consumer equilibrium model used to spend money on products that used to give them highest utility. Here, the producer would spend his or her money on resources that give them the highest output, that gives them the highest output. And that is how this is aligned with the objective which the producer wanted to achieve, that the producer wanted to maximize the output with available amount of investment. So if that is the objective, what you should do, you should spend your money on resources that give you more output against each dollar that you spend on those. Easy? Is this simple? Right? Right? So that was what the producer equilibrium model was, right? Now, moving forward, let me share the strategy that we will use, right? So what we will do is that after we cover, I think we did not, you know, did it for the first unit, but after we complete each major unit or topic, we will do some past papers related to that. We'll do some past papers related to that, right? Now, past paper questions like essay questions especially, right? So that you get a better idea of what type of questions are being asked on the exam and how you should answer those. I'm just confirming one thing, and then we'll move forward for A2. After this, I think it is the type of cost that we have to discuss, right? So in different budget lines, type of revenue. Yeah, got it. Right. Okay, perfect. Now, is this clear? Preet, is everything clear? Any confusion? Anything not clear? So for tomorrow's class, I'll try to find some past paper questions, essay questions related to this topic, right? But for today, let's get started with a new topic, which is the types of cost, right? Cost classification or type of cost. These are the two names that we generally use, right? Let's say types of cost. Now, what do we study? We are just getting some introduction about this topic, but we will get in more details tomorrow, right? Okay. Now, in this topic, we'll talk about that what are the different costs associated with operating a business, right? How do we classify those costs? And obviously, why is that important? Because if you remember, even in the efficiency chapter, and then after that, in this in these topics as well, we did talk about a couple of different costs. We looked at the average cost, we talked about the marginal cost, we talked about fixed cost, variable cost. So there are so many different type of costs and so many different ways how we classify those costs. So it's important that we develop a deeper understanding of types of cost. Does it make sense? Okay. Now, this being said, let's get started, right? So first, obviously a definition. Cost refers to expenses that a business incurs in producing its output, right? So what is the business cost? The business cost includes all the different type of expenditure that a business made towards producing its products, right? Incurs in producing its product, right? Example would include a lot of things. Example, rent, electricity, right? That is used in your office, or the electricity that is used in your factory, depends upon what type of business we're looking at, right? Salaries that you're paying to your workers, the wages that you're paying to it, the raw material expense, right? Blah, blah, blah. The list goes on, right? Easy. Okay. Now, the first simple classification, the first type of classification of cost that we do is to divide these costs into categories, which is fixed and variable cost. These costs are divided into broad categories called fixed and so the first classification that we do is to divide all these costs that a business incurs into two broad categories, fixed and variable cost, right? Now, what is fixed cost, right? So as the word suggests, fixed cost is something that stays constant, right? Do you take accounting? Preet? You do take accounting, yeah, yeah. I just realized you do take accounting, right? So then obviously for you, these will be much easier and simpler to understand. Exactly, right? So what is fixed cost? Fixed cost is the cost component that does not change with the level of output produced, and therefore cost these cost components are not directly proportional to the level of output produced. Right? Is it making sense? So think about this. If I say, simple example of fixed cost that we always take is rent. Now think about this. So if our office, let's talk about mega lecture, right? So our office is located in some place, Islamabad, right? Now, the premises that we have rented out for most businesses, in the modern businesses, you do not buy your premises. Obviously, some very big businesses have their own buildings, right? But for smaller businesses, what they do is they rent out some premises because they are still very young and at a very small scale to afford a complete building of their own, right? So we have rented out some premises, and what we do, we pay rent over there. Now, regardless of the number of students that we have on our platform, right? Regardless of the number of students that who are taking classes with us or anything, we have agreed a fixed amount that we pay every month, right? Right. So whether it is COVID and whether the number has increased or whether the number has decreased or whatever is going on, since we have signed that contract stating that we will pay you monthly rent of this much amount, we have to pay that no matter what. If we do not, we default. If we default on our payments, which means we do not honor our liabilities, we will be, we can be legally penalized, right? For that. Okay. Now this is fixed cost, right? Example would be rent, right? Right. Electricity is often, fixed because regardless of how many students we have, we need a certain amount of electricity that we spend every day due to electricity, being consumed in the charging, the lights that are on, blah, 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 air conditioners, blah, 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 right? So this is the example of rent and electricity. Okay. Another thing that is often fixed are salaries, right? So the full-time staff, the full-time employees who are working constantly, I'm not talking about teachers, please. So I'm talking about, like, let's say I work in the management, right? I make sure that things are operating smooth, the payments are being made, blah, blah, blah. If there are any questions for the students, to answer those questions, all that stuff. So I get a fixed salary for that. For teachers, obviously, that's a revenue sharing model. That's a different story. So that will be part of variable cost. Teacher salaries are variable cost, but uh, the other salaries that other admin people are earning, that is fixed. Okay. Now, the other category is variable cost. What is variable cost? As the word suggests, variable cost is any cost component that changes or varies with the level of output produced, right? Any cost component that is directly proportional to the level of output by the firm, right? Right. Okay. And example of that could be, as I was giving you for mega lectures only, right? Example, teacher salaries. So forget about teacher salaries, because otherwise, in most cases, in most type of businesses, other education related businesses like schools and everything, teacher salaries are fixed, right? So I'm not writing this example because then it might confuse you. So perfect example of this could be raw material, right? So if you produce more output, think of a manufacturing firm. So if manufacturing firm, even a restaurant, if they're producing more food, they're satisfying more customer orders, then obviously they will need to order more raw material, and that means higher, what is that called? Higher raw material expense and so on, right? So that is this thing, wages. Sometimes when you're using temporary workers, right? Temporary workers who are on daily wages and so on, right? So the more the output you produce, the more the type of labor, the more the labor you hire, and the more the labor you hire, the more the wages you pay. Exactly, part-time workers or hourly wages, right? So your hourly workers, the more work you get done, right? The more output you produce, the more work needs to be done, and the more people you hire, and therefore higher will be your wages. Daily or hourly wage workers, right? Okay, we go on this. Okay, and then there could be some other things as well. Depending upon the exact nature of the business, we would have to look at to see whether it's a variable cost or a fixed cost, right? Now, when you add these two components, electricity in some cases can be variable. Yes, now this is where it gets tricky and complicated, right? Right, electricity maybe, right? So office electricity is fixed. Preet, that's a good question. Office electricity is fixed because regardless of how many students you have, you are you are getting, you have to pay the same electricity. However, for your factory, if you produce more output, you will be using machine for longer. Sorry, you will be using your machines for longer, and if so, you will be using more electricity, right? So that would be variable cost then. Does it make sense? Sum of fixed and variable cost is total cost, right? Sum of fixed and variable cost is the total cost, right? We already know this. Now we'll quickly look at the graphs just to be sure that we know these and then move forward, right? Now to make the graph for the fixed cost, have a look at this. So for the fixed cost, the graph looks like a straight horizontal line. It's a straight horizontal line and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't changes with the level of output, right? So it's something of the sort, right? I just realized I did not make straight lines, right? So fixed cost graph would look like this, right? Have a look at this. So on the y-axis, obviously, what do you have? You have the cost. Or what do you have on the x-axis? On the x-axis, you have the output produced, right? Or the quantity of output or the output simply, right? Okay. Now, the shape of your fixed cost will be a straight horizontal line, which means that it's staying constant no matter what, right? So this will be the shape of your fixed cost, right? So if it's, let's say, $10,000 per month or per year or whatever it is, right? Or 5,000 or whatever, right? Rupees or lakh or whatever, right? So that will always be fixed. So regardless of how much output you produce, so whether you produce, you have, as I was giving you the example, whether we have 100 students or we have 200 students or even 10,000 students, our rent expense stays the same, right? So it's not changing. After some time, it does increase. Preet, do you realize that? Because after some time, then if you're really expanding, then we might need a couple of offices, right? So let's say just like it happens in any other country, right? So with too much of expansion, then we might need offices in different cities of Pakistan, Islamabad, Karachi, Lahore, blah, 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 right? Then obviously more rent would mean more premises are being rented out. So rent expense will go up, but otherwise not. At a certain point in time, it will be fixed. Okay, now let's look at the shape. Now let's look at the shape for your variable cost. So variable cost, again, on the y-axis, you will have cost, and on the x-axis, you will have output, right? Now that variable cost starts from your origin. That the graph for the variable cost starts from your origin. Why so? Because if you're not producing anything, just imagine, if you're not producing anything, let's say in COVID, what happened? The restaurants completely shut down. So when there are no restaurants, no one is going to the restaurant, no meal is being produced. So obviously the restaurant would not order raw material and so on, right? So that's why the variable cost also always starts from the origin. The variable cost always starts from the origin. So zero output, no output being produced as it happened in COVID during lockdown. So no cost, no expense, right? But the more you produce, the more you give. Till production of 5,000 units, one supervisor needed, but when production more than what can cost? Exactly, right? So think about this. That would still be classified as, Preet, I got your question, right? Exactly. That is the example I was giving you about rent. So for a certain level of output, you have just one building, but after beyond that level, you rent out more buildings. So then your rent will increase. So same is the example, step cost. Exactly. But that is basically, step cost is also a form of fixed cost. So fixed cost is technically not always fixed because it doesn't make sense, right? Even when you really expand, what happens? Don't you hire more people? So salaries also increase. Even the management salaries, which are otherwise fixed, also increase. So the step cost is basically part of fixed cost. In the accounting exam, yeah, in economics, yeah. So that if you have the option of step cost, if the option says step cost, then you choose that. If not, then you'll say fixed cost. Got it? Preet, is this making sense? And this is your variable cost. Okay, now this one important thing before we wrap our class, and then we'll continue from here in tomorrow's class, right? Now, when you add up the variable and the fixed cost, right, that is known as your total cost. In fact, let me show you on the same graph, right? So let's say now I'm adding both the cost on the same graph. So this was your variable cost, this was your fixed cost, right? Or let's bring it a little lower, right? This is your fixed cost, the orange line, and this uh, purple line is the variable cost. Okay, now let me get rid of this. Now, what is total cost? Total cost is sum of these two costs, as we discussed. What is total cost? Sum of these two costs. Now, when you add these two up, right, that gives you the total cost. Now, have a look at this. So your total cost will start from the point of fixed cost, and it will be parallel to your variable cost. Preet, do you understand? Right? So total cost will start from the point of fixed cost, and it will be parallel to your variable cost. Why so? Because think about it. Even when you're producing zero output, Preet, as I said, even though in COVID no one was producing food, let's say for a restaurant, but you still had the contract with the landowner where your restaurant was located. That premise was, rented out by the restaurant owner, and therefore that restaurant owner had to give rent to the landlord, right? So rent was still there. Is it making sense? Or let's say if there's a security guard with the building, so that was still being paid. So that's why total cost, even when the fixed cost is zero, sorry, even when the variable cost is zero, right, you are giving some cost which is equals to your fixed cost. That's why total cost will always start from the point of fixed cost, and then it goes straight upwards and will be parallel. You understand what parallel is, like the two lines don't intersect, and then it will be parallel to your total cost. But what we discussed today is a very simple version of how cost behaves. And I'm sure you being an accounting student would know, right? And therefore, I said it's a very simple version. And tomorrow we will dive deep into the more complications. Tomorrow we'll dive into more complications, like what is marginal cost. There you'll get a better idea. Breathe. The type of question, the question that you asked me, that after 5,000 units, if you need to hire another supervisor, then where do we record it? So marginal cost give you a better idea of what each additional unit of the good costs you. Right? Breathe. Everything clear for today? So I have a meeting scheduled at 8. I'm really sorry, I will have to run. Otherwise, I always like to stay back a little and explain the concept, right? But if there's still any confusion, I'll explain you in detail. We'll do a quick recap of the cost tomorrow, like the one that we did today, and then move forward. And tomorrow you'll get all the questions answered, right? So I'll see you tomorrow at the same time. And as I said, moving forward from here onwards, except for any exceptions, we will always have a class from 7 to 7:45 Pakistani time. So I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Have a good night. And okay, bye.